Hey, folks, welcome to the live stream. I'm here with Josh City from 86 Boxing. We're here to talk about this footage is from later. This is from 1911. Just putting this on to get you warmed up. We're talking about a 1904 fight between Sam Langford and one of his early career rivals, Dave Holley. Let's get into it. Firstly, as I pull up Langford's all the November fights that I found in his schedule, Josh City, what's happening, brother?
What's going on, Random? Happy to be here. It seems like it's been forever, but we're back in the mix for one of these discussions on the great Sam Langford, as well as the great, underrated, often not mentioned, but you will see his name littered amongst the greats for sure, Dave Holley. So I'm happy to be here, of course, and I look forward to this discussion.
Yeah, this was a great series. So for the uninitiated, Sam Langford in his 28 fight first full season of 1903, he had one setback out of all that to Danny Duane, and he beat the great Joe Gans, the lightweight champion, one of the great fighters of that age, toward the end of the year, and then drew with Jack Blackburn. And Blackburn, Holley, Langford, Gans, these guys were all fighting each other. Holley actually gave Langford his only loss of 1904 in their first fight in Boston. I think I have. Let me just pull this in. Okay, so the first fight. I don't have the preview article, but this is put together. That clipping, that picture of him is not from this article, but I'm mashing stuff together, folks. Shout out to the chat, by the way, to live listeners and to the people afterwards. So, what was the loop punch? Well, in the article, it actually goes into it. So apparently, Holly goes into sort of like up close, especially when someone's trying to hold on to him. He starts swiveling his upper body left and right. And then he's digging to the body, and then he's shooting up uppercuts to the face and head in between that. So he's ripping to the body when he's being held. So, I mean, you can see footage like Jimmy McLaren doing it, possibly something like it, or he would keep his elbows tight and kind of flail from the outside with the body shots, but lots of them. But then even like guys like Marciano, you'd see them throwing low and then come shooting up with these giant uppercuts. So I think Holly was doing that sort of like some bobbing and weaving, but it was well known in this time. And by the end of the fight, Langford was hanging on the first time they fought. Let me see if I can find a description. Okay, let's see. Oh, I cut it short. Okay, Sam Langford, the co-lightweight of Cambridge, who jumped into prominence by getting a well-earned decision over champion Joe Gans at the Criterion AC some months ago, ran against a Tartar at the Cambridge Athletic Association last night in the person of Dave Holley of Philadelphia. Holley administered a sound beating to Langford in the 10 rounds they boxed, and the outcome was a big surprise to the local followers of boxing. Holley's ability to cover up and avoid punishment and his quick recovery when in close was the cause of Langford's downfall. Sam started in his usual snappy style, and his lightning left jab and quick right cross worked well for the first couple of minutes. But after that, Holley changed his style, and his peculiar crouch and guard completely bewildered Langford. The Philadelphian did his best work after Langford's leads, for then he began ripping and tearing away with both hands for the body, varying with twisting his body while Langford held on and shooting his right upward to the jaw and face. This was his famous loop-the-loop punch, and it worked well at times. Whenever Holley essayed to box cleverly, Langford greatly outpointed him, and at such times Holley was forced to resort to his old crouch with his head and jaw protected by his shoulder and his body well covered. Both men devoted a great deal of attention to the body, and Holley proved to be the harder hitter. He early realized that Langford was too clever for him, and then he worked his way inside Langford's guard and began pegging away for the body and head. The early rounds were rather tame and uninteresting, but as the bout progressed, Holley began to show his strength, and in the eighth drove Langford all around the ring with straight rights to the jaw and left and right short arm jolts to the stomach and ribs. The Cambridge man was tired at the end of the round, but he came back strong in the ninth and held his own by jabbing. The last round was a hurricane affair, with Holley doing the forcing and Langford holding on at every opportunity. But even as Sam hung on, Dave slammed away and near the close of the round drove Langford to the ropes with a hard right swing to the jaw. Referee Harry Hodgkins awarded the decision to Holley. It was a popular decision. So boom boom, I guess that corkscrew uppercut is the loop to loop punch, unless they count also the low work. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think that is very interesting, to say the least. And I think it goes to show that Dave Holley is a man who is a force to be reckoned with, I guess you can say, especially during that period of time. And I think it also quells the notion that these guys weren't skilled. These guys didn't think in there. They couldn't move their head out, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we've heard it all as it relates to the fighters back in the day. But this goes to show you, he showed his loop to loop punch. So, I mean, these guys were working on things as the competition was high. Fighting was at a high level at that particular time as far as interest and those in participation. So Dave Holley, he's one that had to learn the trade on the job in some sense. And he did so by fighting against top level competition. And I know, Random, we were discussing this a little bit earlier. When you really look at the totality of his career in general, it wasn't long as far as the amount of years, and he had to go through some adversity, multiple occasions. But it just goes to show that these guys that were fighting back then, they were, in a sense, kind of bred for this type of fighting from a boxing standpoint, because they were thrown in the fire early. So for a guy like Holly, even at this particular point in his career, mind you, at a young age, and that's one of the things that we tend to discuss when we're thinking about fighters and sort of that separation in some facets. This was a younger Dave Holly, and he had already been putting in a lot of work as far as fights overall. And these are pro fights at that, varying rounds, varying lengths against varying competition. A lot of high level competition he had already faced to this point. But it just, as I mentioned there at the top, goes to show that this guy was continually working on something. He was continually looking to get better. And he really had no choice because of the fact that he was going up against the type of competition he was going against. Sam Langford, I mean, he needs no introduction. Dave Holley, he's one who does in some sense, because many today won't really know of him just off of his namesake alone. But Sam Langford needs no introduction. And this was early in Langford's career as well, a guy who was younger than Dave Holley, who was more experienced at that particular point. Just gets to show you those parallels, show you those differences compared to today. Though similarly, we have some guys and gals who fight today who have a high level amateur pedigree, who have an Olympic pedigree. So they do face a lot of competition when you spend a lot of time in those amateur ranks. And of course, we don't see as many fights overall in the pro ranks. But these guys back then, even despite short amateur careers or not really getting to fully flesh out their amateur careers, they had to lace them up, turn pro. And much like when you were in the sort of ranking tournaments, you had to earn your way on the amateur side, those types. Much like that, you had to earn your way there to pro rank. So it wasn't a matter of, hey, I get to pick and choose who I get to fight as I work my way to the title. In those days, you pretty much had no choice but to go through the top level competition. And as you can see, just based on some of the pictures that have come up on screen for those who are watching, that competition is some of the most fierce the sport has seen in the lightweight ranks. And for Dave Holley, just as much as this is a discussion on Sam Langford, and of course we have a lot of material on Sam Langford, Dave Holley is very much one of those guys worthy of mention when we think about the great lightweights. And much like Sam Langford, another one of those guys who wasn't able to capture the title at that weight. But that being said, it'd be a far cry to think that he wasn't capable because he very much was. So I think that fight, the first one, and him introducing that loop to loop punch, him being able to get a win over Langford, who was already showing promise, it just adds a notch or a feather in the cap of Dave Holley.
Yeah, absolutely. And Holley had had more high level fights at this point, as well as like more fights when he went in with Langford. But Langford had fought a tremendous schedule and gained a lot of experience. So I'm pretty sure. So let's see. So Holley debuted, as far as I know, he debuted January 1st, 1900, kicked off the century, right? By October of 1902, he was 38 wins, 5 losses, 8 draws. So he had what is that? 51 fights between January of 1900 and October of 1902. So almost 3 seasons worth of fights. He's up over 50. I mean, talk about some experience. That's according to BoxRec. I probably need to cross-reference with Cyberboxing Zone. I didn't have time. I don't have Holley's entire 1904 typed up, but it is what it is. We do have a lot of tasty graphics, so we'll get what we got. And hold on a second. Let me just check, find my other one. So they rematch. They fight again in Baltimore at the Eureka Athletic Club, I believe, which was run by Joe Gann's manager's brother. It was one of the Hereford brothers. I can't remember his first name. So Langford, he's coming off. He's now got two losses out of all of his fights. He's only gotten a setback against Danny Duane in 1903, Dave Holley in 1904. And he has, so let's see, 28, 38, 42 fights in those 2 seasons. He has 2 setbacks. Holley's just too much. He's using basically where he says his old crouch with his head and jaw protected by his shoulder and his body well covered sounds a lot like a shoulder roll, considering how they're describing it. So if he's shoulder rolling and throwing those big uppercuts, he's a tricky guy, and Langford can't figure him out, even though Langford is spanking a lot of other fighters at this time and already beat Joe Gans over 15 rounds. But the day before Joe Gans fought and lost to Langford, Holley had a pretty lively 6 rounds with him in a different city. These guys kept crazy schedules. Langford did it too, fought back-to-back days. I'm pretty sure Holley did. So they're booked again, this time at the Eureka Athletic Club. The article there says at Cambridge a week ago, but it was actually a few weeks prior. So it was just someone poor recollection or whatever. But anyway, so it was an upset win. Holley got over him in Cambridge and his hometown too. But this is the lead up. So Langford is famous to the degree that he is famous. He's famous for being avoided. But look at all the people that want to fight the winner of the rematch between Holley and Langford. This is scheduled to happen the day before the lightweight champion Joe Gans is fighting the welterweight champion Barbados Joe Walcott on the other coast. So on the West Coast, they're going to do that the day after, and the winner of this is supposed to challenge the winner of that. And yeah, Maurice Hereford. So he's the secretary of the Eureka Athletic Club, but Al Hereford was, I think that was his first name, was Joe Gann's manager. So they kind of double dip in, or just a lot of managers ran clubs. That's how you have a stable and you bring people in to fight them and you send you guys off. So the people who wanted to fight the Holley Langford winner included Jack Blackburn. Obviously, he'd already fought these guys, but Blink McCluskey, Jack O'Keefe, Honey Melody, who would later duck Langford, Mike Twin Sullivan, who would later duck Langford, Jimmy Gardner, who wasn't matched for Langford. I don't know if it was a duck, though. Kid Williams and Willie Fitzgerald, neither of whom, to my understanding, fought Langford, and Herman Miller. So a lot of people wanted, this is when Langford, he has been beaten by Holley and he has been beaten by Danny Duane. So even though he beat a bunch of other guys and he's now a welterweight contender, there are guys willing to fight him amongst the welterweights. He's not as feared as he will later become. Later on, people will just out and out bar him. Like, I'll fight anyone, well, except for Sam Langford. It'll become a meme. But this So anyway, that was a. Let me see. Is this the one for? Yeah. So they fought. They were both strong at the finish, and yeah, and it said it was announced. It turned out that Gans Walcott. I think they fought within a pound of the welterweight limit, but it was a non-title fight last minute. And then shortly after, Walcott shoots himself in the hand, and then people are making welterweight claims, including Langford's people. I guess I should bring that up. So they fight 15 rounds for draw. That's the second fight. So now Holley's up 1-0-1 in the series. Yeah, here we go. Joe, do you want? Can you read that, Josh? You want to read that out for the people?
Sure.
Sure.
The left side
Left
or
side
right?
or right? It's all the same article. I just chopped it up.
Okay, cool,
Okay,
cool.
cool.
I'll read the part on Honey Melody, who ultimately died. We're seeing that quoted there, Langford. But essentially, Honey Melody, who was a very solid fighter for sure. If you haven't heard of him, he was, I believe, former world welterweight champion, if I'm not mistaken, and the very solid fighter. Had a lot of good competition that he went up against. But Honey Melody dodged him last week when we proposed to make a match. If none of the boxers here about will meet him, I shall take him to Chicago, Philadelphia, and other cities and force the welterweights to box him or acknowledge Langford as the champion. There is a great deal of truth in what Mr. Whitman says. For the past 2 years, Langford has been forging to the front rapidly. When he was matched to meet Walcott last Labor Day, the greater part of the sport here said it was a check or what am I seeing there? Cinch
Cinch
for
for
Walcott.
Walcott. Cinch, yeah.
Yes, and that he would win in a couple of rounds, but Langford proved a great surprise. It was the same when Langford was matched to meet Gans last December. Gans was expected to make a mark of Langford, but the Boston boxer made the lightweight champion look like a novice at times and clearly outpointed him. So I think that certainly kind of just highlights some of the, I guess you can say, politics. We still see some of this today in the sport of boxing, where if you're a great fighter, or you can see in some regards a good fighter, you have that potential of being great. Yeah, getting everyone lined up isn't necessarily as straightforward as one may think. And of course, that's something we saw with Sam Langford. And just think about it. Langford, we know him primarily, at least, as a heavyweight, but when you really dive into his career, especially that early portion, he was applying his trade in the same weights as some of the greats among the lightweights, welterweights, middleweights, like heavyweights. And I think that just adds to the overall appeal for Langford and why more and more who are becoming aware of him are recognizing him as one of the greats, if not the greatest fighter of all time, because of the stops along the way. And in some regards, for boxing, things can't necessarily be apples to apples. And sometimes it is a situation where it's apples to oranges. And if you think about Sam Langford, you can get some of that when you think about matching him with some of the other heavyweights that we know to be the greatest heavyweights to have laced him up. Langford being more of an undersized heavyweight overall, and some of those guys having weight, reach, height advantages on him. And depending on the heavyweight, some you could argue from a power standpoint, match up just as well, if not more. George Foreman, Joe Louis. You think about from a speed standpoint, Muhammad Ali, and just Langford being really 5'7", I guess you can say 5'7", probably with his shoes on, and having some proportions that were above average. Of course, his length and reach, as far as his arms, of course, broad chest and shoulders. But that being said, it's not apples to apples when matching him with some of those heavyweights, and that can make it tricky. But if you look at some of the guys he went up against, and we do have that information, we do have comparable comparisons to a number of heavyweights we've seen in history, then you could see that he was sort of a enigma, freak of nature in some sense, and therefore I think there's a place for him without it matching up and being as clear cut from the standpoint of the measurables when you're comparing him to some of these other heavyweights. It's much like the eras as well. Not everything's are going to match up, or not everything is going to match up, and not every fighter is going to look and feel like the fighters that you're accustomed to. But that being said, there is still a level of greatness that you can seep out just from the comparisons in general and diving into their careers. And one of the things I know that I've said as it relates to Langford is not just Langford, but just in the elites of them all in general, that sometimes once you get to a certain level, there's not a ton that separates you. We're thinking the elites of the elites. You think about the Langfords, Harry Greffs, Henry Armstrongs, Joe Gans. You think about those guys. There's not a ton of separation. There are small incremental things that come into the fold, and that can kind of help break down certain aspects. But then when you add that and the layers of weight classes behind it, that adds an extra bit of value to the likes of Sam Langford, because of the fact that we can look at those elites he went up against at lightweight. We can look at the elites he went up against at welterweight. We can do the same going all the way up to heavyweight. Now, that doesn't take away from those guys who are naturally just born into heavyweight bodies once they're fully formed and fleshed out. But that being said, you have to certainly add a bit of a marker to the likes of a guy like Langford, who is able to defy odds that were tied to a person of his size and his weight and his overall length measurables, the things that we're talking about. And those numbers, in some sense, didn't matter because he just had a level of skill, and then those other natural attributes and athletic aspects of him that allow for him to be able to accomplish things that the typical boxer wouldn't have been able to accomplish at that particular time, or the typical boxer might not have been able to accomplish at any particular time. And that's where it comes down to, as I was mentioning, some of the apples to oranges comparisons, because of the fact that, hey, we did get to a point where you saw less, and I would say we're there now for sure. In the modern times, you saw less situations where you'd have a guy who started out at the welterweight or lightweight or even we'll say 140 pounds, who ended up or who will end up at heavyweight. So just many things to factor in, but to the crux of what was listed there in the article that was initially up, hey, it was no different from Langford at welterweight than it was at heavyweight. I mean, if you get a certain type of fighter who is starting to show particular strides at the right time, then most certainly If the other fighters don't take notice, the people around them take notice. Their management, their promoters, others involved with the sport, especially when there's a financial aspect tied to it, which, of course, this is prize fighting. And therefore, the appeal from their perspective of taking on a guy like Langford was most certainly higher risk than reward, and that was pretty much any way you sliced it. And it is not necessarily from a draw perspective, but more so from the standpoint of taking on a guy like Langford and just given what we know of him in the trajectory, not unlike Joe Gans, who popped on the screen. If you lose to a guy like that, or especially if you lose a title to a guy like that, then certainly you'd be a bit hard pressed in getting it back. And of course, we know those titles carried value just as they do today. In the four belt era or multi belt era, they carry value. So, most certainly, in a time where there were far few belts and far more fighters than there are today, it carried value.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. So it's, there were multiple belts to set, like at heavyweight, there were multiple belts. After Walcott hurt himself, there were people claiming the white welterweight championship. Langford's manager claimed the American welterweight championship. That's what that article was about that you read part of. There were claims of a white lightweight championship during Gans' reign. They just started claiming it and then refused to fight. They did end up making the fight. Just to touch on the fight for the first time, the fight that we're actually focusing on here today, the third bout between them. So let me see if I can pull up the appropriate. Yeah, so this is the week's schedule, the principal bouts of that week, leading into the Friday fight between Dave Holley and Langford in Philly. 6 rounds, no decision, meaning to out and out win, you have to stop your guy. If he doesn't foul out, you have to stop him. Otherwise, there's no official decision. And let me see here if I can find. Sorry about the rustling paper here. I took a couple notes earlier just to try and keep myself semi-coherent. See, I matched again. Man, I took a lot of notes. Yeah, so it was the Philly item had it a draw, though Langford was down in the third round of this bout. And I'll pull up but the principal fight of that week was Jimmy Britt claiming the white lightweight championship against Joe Gans, the actual lightweight champion. So that's an awesome week of fights there. You got Philadelphia Jack O'Brien's fighting that week. Benny Yanger. Let's see, what else is there? Arthur Cote and Walter Burgo. Those are two prior opponents of Langford's. Willie Fitzgerald was fighting that week. Holy cow. Aldomont, I went with Langford on one of his forays to England. He fought on the. Actually, I think he headlined over Langford when Langford fought Tiger Smith, the Welsh middleweight for the British middleweight championship. I think Aldomont fought Digger Stanley or he fought someone. I can't remember the guy's name. I'm not good with names, I'm afraid. But I'm pretty sure he fought on that same card. And he'd already fought on the same card as Langford earlier in both of their careers. Like in Langford's 1903, I believe. But let's see. So the fight happens. Here we go. Boston welterweight finishes strong in his 15-round affair with Dave. Oh, no, this is the Baltimore one. I'm sorry, folks. Where's the review of this? Here we go. Is this the preview? Sam Langford, the hard-hitting color box of the city, will have an opportunity to reverse the decision which Dave Holley gained over him some months ago in Cambridge. They clash in Philadelphia Friday night, and Langford, who was trained faithfully, is confident of outpointing the dusky Philadelphian. Now it says Friday. Yeah. So fight fans of the Quaker City expect to see one of the best lightweight bouts of the year when Sam Langford of Boston and Dave Holley, the cracked Philadelphia boy, on Friday night next hook up. Those 6 rounds only will be fought. The fast 10-round battle at Boston last spring of these two colored lads at the Cambridge Athletic Association, which Holley won by a bare margin won, ensures the fans a good battle this, I assume that says week. I can't read it. I cropped it off. And it was actually the first fight. Holley pretty clearly won the first fight. It wasn't close. At least from the reports I saw, what we saw, Josh, it seems like Holley pretty clearly got him after the first few rounds. So here we go. Nice write-ups. I mean, I know we don't have footage of these things, but we have a little bit of footage of Langford, and we have footage of people in the early era, enough footage to know that certain people really know what they were doing. And so we got a decent little write-up of this fight. Grueling contest. Dave Holley and Sam Langford, the Boston colored welterweights, boxed a draw at the Manhattan Athletic Club in Philadelphia last night. It was a hard and grueling contest from first to last, and at the end, it was about a toss-up as to who had the best of it. Holley went right to work in the first round and soon had Langford busy taking care of himself. Langford showed that he was the cleverer boxer of the two, but Holley was handling him out the stiffest kind of argument. Langford had the best of the first half of the second round, but his lead did not last long, for Holley began to wallop him in the body in a way that soon had the Boston boy holding on to escape a punishment. In the third round, Holley took a decisive lead, and it looked as if he was a sure winner. He knocked Langford down, but Sam was up in a jiffy. A little later, Holley rushed Langford to a corner where he slipped to the floor. The fourth round saw Langford doing better. He began to see that he must box cleverly to keep Holley from clinching and roughing it. He kept jabbing and punching Holley at long range, and once had Dave wobbly and forced him to the ropes. Dave laughed, but his teeth were bleeding, and his humor was forced and unnatural. Dang, that's a harsh writer. The fifth round was about even, both men boxing fiercely and neither willing to give an inch. The sixth was in Langford's favor. He used a left-hand jab to good advantage, and I can't read that. It's a good and something. Holley fought gamely, but Langford did not give him a chance to clinch very much, and near the end of the round, Dave appeared to be getting tired. So that's for 6 rounds. They shouldn't. Holley was like a specialist at 6 rounders. Langford ended up with more experience in long fights, although he was stopping a lot of guys, so I don't know if he'd had a lot of long fights. But yeah, but that's a pretty decent write-up for the fight. They had a real fight in this third bout. Holley had beaten him on 10, over 10, then they drew over 15, and now they had a terrific 6 rounder. So what do you think of that action, Josh?
Very nice write up, as you mentioned, kind of what we've alluded to in previous conversations as far as back during that era or those times in general, just given what we were working with from a technological standpoint. Of course, print media was king, and therefore you had a lot of variation, but there are often pretty detailed write-ups for fights during this period, even periods beforehand. I mean, we can recollect on the stuff happening back in the days of bare knuckle, etc. So just think about that. All of this was done for the most part through print media. So it's a common thing to see pretty detailed write-ups and accounts for the times there. So even when you see things that are, or see fights that are newspaper decisions, for instance, there are detailed accounts associated with them. So you might have some varying opinions and varying accounts of who won the fight. But that being said, there's some validity to it. I mean, it's no different than the opinions that we have today, because of course we're still as opinionated on fights as we were back then. And the only difference is, of course, we often have, or we don't run into the situation where you have these bouts that ultimately have to go to newspaper decisions, as was the case back then, just given laws, regulations, etc. So in seeing a fight of this magnitude or caliber, just in general, yeah, I think it just speaks to just what I was speaking on a bit earlier as far as competition at the time, and that the factor, and even though these guys were at a young age, certainly This was them just kind of building into the fighters they were. Not a ton of separation from an overall perspective, but of course we would see later on as Langford continued to move up the ranks, then he would start to extend himself beyond the likes of even a Dave Holley. But certainly during his time at lightweight, Dave Holley was very much one of those guys who was just as good as any you would have seen during that particular period. And that includes dealing with the champions of the time. And of course, the champion being the great Joe Gans, the old master. So it's not surprising that these two men had some close fights. And you could see that through trial, uh, certainly after that first fight that Langford lost, he continued to work his craft, and with the two fighting multiple times from there, that edge started to close a bit as far as Holley got him that first time around, and what was the longest fight of the series. But we know where things would end for Sam Langford, and no question, just given his trajectory and how his career shaped up, he would have similarly had, I'd imagine, further success at lightweight, were that a weight that was suited for him as he continued to mature in his career. But with that in mind, you just got to see two young fighters who were scrappy and certainly not ducking each other or the competition during that period. And it's tougher to compare it sort of to modern times, but even in modern times, you have situations where you get young fighters who are certainly entering their prime, who are matched up early in their careers, and we see some of that here today. We're going to get something like that with Bam Rodriguez versus the fighter from England. I can't think of his name right now, but similarly with Langford and Holley, yeah, you just had two very young fighters who were going at it at a young age. They're growing together, and a surprising thing associated with it, believe it or not, regardless of a loss. And thank you, Andre Rodriguez, Sonny Edwards. Yeah, so Sonny Edwards, Bam Rodriguez, we're going to get two young fighters who have just been on the rise, and the time is not. I mean, there's no better time than right now for these young guys to go at it. But essentially, with Langford and Holley, despite that young age and despite a loss or a draw or whatever, it didn't diminish who these fighters ultimately became, what they represent, and their overall career. And that's one thing that I think that we have to learn to move past a bit more here in modern times, though it's a lot different technologically as far as access for the casual fan, but a loss never dictated how great a fighter would become. I mean, if we look back in history, there are fighters with several losses, and that hasn't changed the fact that they were some of the greatest fighters that the sport has ever seen. And by comparison, we can look at now. There are fighters with losses who are going to go down as some of the great fighters of this era, and ultimately that the sport has seen, especially thinking about it from the modern standpoint. And by that same token, there are fighters without any losses who are not going to go down as the greatest fighters that the sport has seen, let alone the greatest fighters of their era, etc. So, you have those types of situations in the sport, but you take a guy like Dave Holley and you look at his records, you look at his box rec. and you just take it at face value. You might not think much of it, but if you really dive into it and you see what this fighter was able to accomplish, some of the wins he was able to gain, some of the losses, and who they were against, then I think you can really gain an appreciation for just how good of a fighter he was and why fighters like Sam Langford, etc., who would go on to be the true standouts of these eras, why they were able to do so, because none of that would have happened without individuals like Dave Holley, individuals like George Cole, and the list goes on. These are guys, or these are fighters. And Redham and I, we were discussing this off air before coming on. These are fighters that you're oftentimes not gonna hear mentioned. We have some who highlight them at varying points, but it's still gonna take a good deal of time and effort before they become truly known commodities, even just from a historical perspective, just because of how much access and technology we have now, and the number of fighters who in or around these eras who were able to seep through the cracks, do great things, and their names carried a bit further. But these guys, I mean, I think they're going to continue to get their just due and recognition as time goes on, even if it's 100 100 years from now. Much like I'd imagine 100 years ago, or during the times of Langford, during the times of Dave Holley, Barbados Joe Walcott, they probably couldn't have fathomed that we'd be here at this point and we'd have a great array of conversation surrounding these fighters as though they were just fighting the other day, or as though they were active right now. But it just shows you certain strides we make from a technological standpoint have allowed for us to be able to do this, as well as us being able to get this information captured in a way to allow for individuals like random individuals like Andre, those in attendance here, etc., to be able to dive into these fighters and extend the conversation on their career. So that certainly can't be taken for granted right there. So there's an appreciation I know that we all have when we dive into the history of the sport. And it's not for everyone, of course. You're going to have those who are never going to see these fighters in the same light as those individuals that they can see with their own eyes right here and now. By that same token, that's something we can't change because that ultimately comes down to individual opinion. But that being said, one thing that can't be taken away is what these fighters were able to accomplish, what they were able to do in their time. And regardless of an individual opinion, what happened, and we are now just witness to history. So much kudos to these guys, and I think that just even a show like this, just to kind of touch on in this manner the fights that these gentlemen fought in, particularly, of course, subject the third fight, I think that just adds to the overall value of these fighters.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. And here's one more review of it. That it's like that. To me, they're fighting seasons, they're fighting schedules, and it's not every fight announcement, but in general, the papers, they're reviewing you at the end of the year, Christmas holidays and all that. Some guys are even fighting around that time, Christmas, Boxing Day, New Year's, but generally the papers at the end of December, early January, they review the whole year, talk about the principal bouts. the main papers, that is, and that's a great source of information to just find out what was relevant, at least to the writer in that market, nationally, internationally, and then in the region. But these guys were fighting seasons, so having losses doesn't mean it's like today you might say have 20 fights, right, of varying difficulty, and then you start having big fights, and you just keep having tough fights until you can't take it anymore, and then you retire. Back in the day, like getting prominent opponents, getting people who really know what they were doing, like getting past the local guys and stuff, but keeping a crazy schedule, it's very hard to go undefeated. There were notable guys who did it even in their opening season or two, but to keep that going once you step up to the high level and still having fights in between because clubs will pay you to come and fight their favorite from their club. So Langford was fighting all over. Holley was fighting a lot in Philly, but he did travel as well. And like maybe Josh, maybe I should just talk a little bit about some of Holley's prominent fights, just briefly.
Oh
I
yeah.
won't go all the way back, but let's pick up like he fought Gans in Lancaster, PA. They fought a no decision fight over 10 rounds. He lost to Gans. He was down 4 times in that fight. That was October 14th, 1902. Philly Item and the Inquirer and the Trenton Times all had it for Gans. Holley had been fighting almost 3 years at that point professionally, and he was 38-5-8 going into that fight. Gans was 124, 7 and 15, at least 124, 7 and 15 per box rec going into that fight. Just an incredible resume. Gans. See, Holley was 21 years old. I'm not sure how old Gans was at that point, but he wasn't. He was in his 20s still. Then let's see. So also in 1902, in October, he fights and loses, according to the Philly Item, in Philly to Danny Duane, who would beat Langford, give Langford his only 1903 loss. So I threw him in there. Duane had 26 wins, 12 losses, and 8 draws coming into the fight. Holley was up to he was 38, 6-8 going into it. After that, he fights Duane again. The Philly Item has it for Duane again. That's in December of that same year. And January the next year, January 1903, stops Joe Handler in 2 rounds. It's a good win. Then he fights Blackburn in Philly in May of 1913. And the Philly Item had it for Blackburn, and the Philadelphia Record had it as a draw. But a 6-round fight with the great Jack Blackburn. Blackburn was 15-0-4 per box rec going into that. But Blackburn always claimed to have a great deal more fights than what we have listed for him. So he might have had a ton of experience. He didn't just fight as Jack Blackburn. There were other names, it seems like. But Holley by then was 44 wins, 10 losses, 8 draws. So yes, a lot of them 6-round fights, but he's now fought some real class in there. Danny Duane, Joe Handler was pretty darn good. But Gans, obviously, the great of that age, of that weight. Blackburn, then June of, 1903, he fights a draw with Sam Bolin, who was 42-10 and I think 28 draws. So, I mean, Bolin at that, so yes, some of them are 6-round fights, but Bolin has got like, what's he got? 72, 80 fights going in. He's lost 10 of his 80 fights. That might be a better way to put it. Holley's lost 11 of his 70 fights. These guys have some deep experience fighting all these different styles. And the 6-round fight, just like the third fight between Langford and Holley, you could go real pace over 6 rounds. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien was really good with that at middleweight and above. 6-round fights, there's a different pacing you can do. Holley was really good with that. He didn't have a ton of experience in longer fights, which is something that Langford did build up, even though he stopped a lot of the guys that were scheduled for long fights. But he fought a 20-rounder in his first year. He fought Belfield Walker, first full year, 1903, fought 20 rounds. After 2 weeks after the loss to Danny Duane, I think it was 2 weeks, he went down to Rhode Island and beat Belfield Walcott, the welterweight champion's brother, who was a lightweight, beat him over 20 rounds. So early in his career, getting a lot of good experience. But let's see, then Holley gets a one-sided upset win over Spike Sullivan, powerful and popular fighter, brother of one of the champions of the time. And and it's in Philly, and it's a no-decision fight, but the Philly Item has it for Holley. And hometown papers I don't know how much bias there may or may not have been. I've seen people mention Philly bias, but I've also seen a lot of decisions in Philly go against the local fighters. So I'm not sure if that was just some moaning by other authors or if that was a real thing. But anyway, then he fights Young Star. He stopped Young Star 4 rounds of six. Young Star was 30 wins, 15 losses, 14 draws going into that fight. Holley's now up over 50 wins, 52 wins, 11 losses, 13 draws. This is early, this is October 1903. 8 days later, he goes in again with Sambolin and he stops him in four this time. So he's really putting it on people. He gets another fight with Gans. They fight in Philadelphia in October of 1903. And the Philly item has it and the Philadelphia record both have it as a draw. The Boston Journal thought Gans slightly got the edge. But these guys are both very experienced now. Gans has more high-level experience, but Holley's been in there himself, including with Gans. And then November, I need to take a breath in a minute, but November 1900, we're still only in 1903. How crazy is that, Josh? He fights Blackburn again in
Yeah.
Philly. No decision. The Philly item had it for Holley, close fight. So 6 rounds and he gets the best of Blackburn. That's very impressive. Blackburn was going to get the best of Langford before the end of the year. He'd already gotten, or he was about to get the best of Joe Gans over 6 rounds. And then a prearranged draw with Langford that Blackburn was clearly the best man in the majority of the rounds. So getting the best of Blackburn, that's epic. That's Blackburn's otherwise undefeated season, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder if I uploaded his Blackburn's year. I may not have. No, I didn't. It's not important. But anyway, so then he fights Joe Gans again. 6 rounds. Why did I not write down the result? Do you have BoxRec pulled up? December 7th, 1903. That's the one.
Yes.
That's the day before he loses that fight, right?
December 7th, 1903. Give me one sec. It looks like, yes, it loses it to Joe Gans.
I should have uploaded. If I had more time, I would have uploaded the write up of that fight because that was apparently a pretty good fight. But anyway, so okay, so Joe Gans that closes out. No, it doesn't quite. On the 30th, he fights Belfield Walcott, the brother of the welterweight champion, and wins on points over 12 rounds. That one's in Boston. Now he's done for the year. Holy cow. You see, it's December 7th, and he's fought a bunch of fights. He's fought in October, November, and December, and you think he's done, but he just snuck one more in. So I'll try and speed up. So Holley's 04. Tim Kearns, common opponent with Langford. Some of these guys, I didn't write down the result. That's pretty silly. I'm pretty sure he beats Kearns. I just don't know if he stops him. That's in January. In March, fights Steve Crosby. I don't know if you have that pulled up, Josh. I can't see the result. I didn't make note of it brilliantly.
Yeah, it's decision win over 6 rounds.
Steve Crosby, 47, 11, and 18 at that point. So he had a lot of experience. And obviously, there's a lot of fights happening in Philly, especially it's fight town, and a lot of 6 rounders. So guys can keep a busier schedule than if you were fighting 10, 12, 20, 45 round fights like some of these guys would. So then the next fight Holley has, this in August, or the next one that I wrote down in August 29th, 04, he fights Joe Grimm. Joe Grimm wanted to fight Langford at this point. And I saw the newspaper joking that he wanted the Langford fight, but he was probably going to get spanked by Holley, and then Langford would be matched with someone credible. Well, it turns out Holley fights in April the next month, like whatever, 10 or 11 days later, he fights Langford in Cambridge, and he goes over, and that's where he gets the win. Langford's 20 wins, 1 loss, 10 draws, possibly other fights in that time. But basically, he's only lost one of his 31 fights that we know of. Holley's got 61 wins at that point in his career, 12 losses, 14 draws. And like I said, he's been within a lot more. He's been in there with a lot more high-class fighters than Langford had. And common opponent in Danny Duane and some other guys. But yeah, so that was Langford's 32nd. Well, I found a fight, but I don't have a result for it. So 33rd fight, professional fight. That was Holley's 88th professional fight. And that, like I said, that's only Langford's second professional loss. And he already had a win over Gans. And then later this year in 04, he's going to fight a draw and slightly get the best of Barbados, the great Barbados Joe Walcott, the welterweight champ, who Holley fought, who Gans fought. Like these guys all fought each other, or a lot of them did. So in April, let's see, fights Dewey Cook, 61 wins, 19 losses, 9 draws, uh, gets a win according to the Philly item. This in Philly, no decision, 6 rounder. And I think that was an English fighter visiting. Then let's see, May of '04, he draws with Jack Bennett, who I believe is a welterweight. Yeah. Then he fights Blackburn, draws with Jack Blackburn. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's a draw with Bennett according to the Philly item. My goodness, let's see what else we got. June 6th, fights Joe Grin, beats him up for 6 rounds again. And then June 27th, 1904, fights the great Joe Gans. And to a draw. The Philly Ledger had it for Holley. The Baltimore Sun quoted the Philly press as having it for Holley. So I guess the Baltimore Sun said the Philly press had it for Holley, whatever that's worth. Philly item, the Philly Record had it for Gans. And the Philly Inquirer couldn't decide on a winner. And apparently later, the Pittsburgh Gazette referenced it as a clear win for Holley, but that we take with a grain of salt, I'm sure. That was Holley's 97th fight, pro fight, and that was Gans' 172nd fight. I'm going to take a couple breaths. Josh, 97 fights on one side, 172 on the other. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's the stuff of legends right there. Can't even make that stuff up. I mean, it's only common during these early eras, just given where the sport is now. And think about it, maybe that's for the better because just think about all the wear and tear for fighters to go through so many fights within just short periods of time, really, when it all boils down to it. And we know that the sport in itself is safer now than it has ever been. And that's really been the common theme as far as a lot of the changes that have taken place. It's to make the sport a bit more safer and to make things a bit more accessible for fighters, i.e., belts. You look at, sometimes there are fights these days where special belts are made just specifically for those fights, things of that nature. And that is, you could argue, good as well because they do bring certain forms of value, and there's no question about that. And that does put you on a pedestal in some sense. But certainly, just look at the amount of fights that these individuals were having back then, and this was the way to pay the bills. So you oftentimes, especially early in your career, couldn't afford the days off. You couldn't afford to be in a particular region and not have as many fights as possible. I spoke to this before, and I'll share again, of course, just given the times for a lot of these fighters, outside of course, if you're in your hometown or general area, um, a lot of these fighters, when you travel to a particular region, you travel to a particular country, you weren't going there for one fight like we see today, of course, because we can get there in a snap by comparison. But when you were going to these places, hey, you were going to fight as many fights as you could against as much competition as you could, especially competition that would add to just your overall name and the potential of you getting a shot at that title. So you think about some of these records that we would see there early on. Yeah, if you were heading to a particular location, then yeah, you were going to tough it out. Yes, you were injured. Yes, you may have gotten cut the week before or just mere days before, but you know what? You still have to fight. Yeah, you have no choice. It's your livelihood. It's the way you have to operate. And the game in itself isn't going to slow down for you. I mean, we complain about the inactivity of some of these fighters here today in what is pretty much an inactive era. And that is somewhat by design, I guess you can say, just given what is available for a number of these guys, especially at the top level. There are certain dates, certain financial agreements in place, etc. So you see less, and they certainly, in most cases, get paid more, although that's not always the case, just by comparison. But that being said, yeah, safety is usually the earmark. And back then, yeah, it was more so about the fight in itself, and the people wanted it and demanded it. So you had to take advantage of those opportunities. So if you see what's on screen, Langford in the month of November, nearly fighting fight for every day of November. Hey, that's just what you had to go through, and it didn't matter. Um, it didn't matter if you weren't good, or you weren't available, or you wouldn't have um, previously been available, or in certain circumstances been available. You just had to take advantage of what you take advantage of the opportunity that was before you. We could call Langford the November Man just based on what's listed here in terms of just the sheer amount of fights he had in November that were at a high level. And this in itself could be a career for many fighters by today's standards. But it just goes to show, um, yeah, it's just the times you had to adjust to and acquiesce to the times that you were in. So when we think about these comparisons and such, yeah, everything can't necessarily be at face value, especially if you look at an older fighter and making an assumption on them based on a video. What you really have to do is, as I mentioned before, just kind of dive into things and learn and understand the true mark of these fighters by virtue of what they were able to do. And regardless of the time, whether it was 1904 or 2024, at the end of the day, it was boxing. You were fighting. And while the sport in itself may have changed from an overall perspective as far as safety, the amount of fighters we see in the business, the types of athletes we may see in the business, etc., a fight is still a fight. And the intent behind a fight is still the same intent in 1904 as it is here in 2023, as it will be in 2024 and beyond. So that's one thing to really think about. So it's hard to just sum things up at face value, or you just seeing a video of a fighter and making an assumption based on just watching a single video that you may see pop across your screen or something of that nature, and you take that assumption and run with it. It's certainly not as clear cut as it may seem. And another thing I've said before, yeah, I'd imagine, and this is just my opinion, but if you envision yourself being back in, say, 1904, if I envision myself in 1904, uh, but just for someone who may have less of a taste for the older fighters, or who may have less of a regard for them and don't think that they were capable by comparison to you as individuals today, and the notion of they being modern and being bigger and stronger and faster from an overall standpoint. Just hey, just think about yourself today and envision you being in 1904. say you're standing in front of Sam Langford. It can be this younger version of Langford, about 140 something pounds, and you can be whatever you are. And just envision yourself fighting him. And you have 100 plus years of data surrounding you. I mean, you have it there. It's on the internet. You can look it up. You can prepare. You can go back, and you'll have all the advantages from a knowledge standpoint, or at least that is what seems to be the notion or the train of thought for a lot of individuals who I see who kind of disrespect some of the older fighters. And this is not just to pick on them, but you can take all the information that you have available, all of this training, all of these training methods. Uh, you can take all of this stuff with you. You can go back to 1904. You can stand there in front of Sam Langford, and if you fight him, I'd be interested in knowing or seeing how that goes, because I guarantee you that he's going to fight just as much as you are going to fight with all the knowledge that you have here passed down over time. And if I were a betting man, yeah, I'd lean more towards him, because I know that he will have fought through different situations, different things that, from a luxury standpoint, aren't available to individuals such as myself here, or individuals that you may know here in modern times. So that's one way of looking at it. Envision yourself being back there, standing in front of this man in 1904 with everything you have available to you now. And at the end of the day, the two of you have to fight. So,
Yo, if I can jump in, Josh, it's also, and I got to point out, that's a typo in this graphic. That fight up there in gray, February 23rd. It's actually February 24th. I didn't have time to fix it once I noticed it. That was the one I found. But like Sam Langford was a well-oiled machine. When he fought Gans, he'd already been in there 26 times. You know what I mean? That year. And some of those guys are tough fighters. Those weren't all easy fights. Some of them went to points. Some other guys he stopped. Danny Dwayne got the best of him. Came on strong with some speed at the end of the fight. But so 1904, he's coming into 1904. He fought December 23rd was his last fight of 1903. So it's like, holy cow. And I've also got a typo on this 1904 because Tommy Sullivan did not go the distance. He got stopped in, he's from Lawrence. He was undefeated welterweight. He got stopped, I think, in 3 or 4. I think it was a TKO in the fourth, maybe the early fourth. But anyway, so sorry about that, folks. I still have typos, but now at least I'm noticing them. But so he comes in, so he fights January 6th. So this is the thing about Langford. So he's had 28 fights in the previous 12 months, right? Won or drew, other than no contest, won or drew it all except for Danny Dwayne, and then beat, Patsy Sweeney. That was a really good win. Stopped him in the last round. Shadow Morris was considered a pretty solid win. One of the top local guys, Tim Kearns, that was a good win. He got himself injured in the second round, but had multiple fights with Andy Watson. I mean, he's fighting some dudes, but Joe Gans right there, that's epic. Then Blackburn gets the best of him in a pre-range draw, so now Blackburn has some bragging rights. But Holley had beaten Blackburn, so it's like it all folds together, and as we know, Gans had beaten Holley. So it's like, Blackburn and Langford beat Gans, but Gans beat Holley. I don't know if did Gans and then Blackburn beat Gans. It all weaves together, and it's all happening in a season. So 1904, these guys like burst up into the welterweight ranks. Holley's fighting at welter now. Blackburn's fighting at welter. Langford's fighting at welter. Honey Melody's out there fighting at welter, because I think, looking at his record, he fought some feathers and lightweights on his way up. But he's at welter. He might have been a welter fighting smaller guys. It's not necessarily mean that he was small, but anyway, he's in the mix here. A lot of stuff going on. Even after Walcott gets hurt, there's a lot of stuff going on, but Langford just keeps going up. And the last fight that Langford and Holley have in 1905, the fourth fight, Langford has about 13 pounds on him, and it's a badass fight. But in the process, Langford puts a pretty heavy thumping on him. Even though he gets knocked down by Holley and he gets, I think, one eye closed, but he knocks one of Holley's teeth out. It's like a crazy fight. And not long after that fourth fight they had, Holley got it. They were afraid he had fractured his skull, but there was a bad head clash and he went to the hospital. Even though he only took a week off, which is insane. Um, you have that pulled up. Who was that? Was it Kid Farmer or someone like that? I forget who he was fighting.
Kid Wilson.
Kid Wilson, yeah, and came back. Was it a week? He took a week off for a
Yeah,
bad head clash that sent him to the hospital. So I
yeah.
don't know if that affected his performances, but I mean, Holley was a very good fighter, but with lots of technique. But I don't know at what point he started to lose athleticism. I think by the last time he fought Blackburn, they were saying he wasn't the same. So he fought from 1900 to 1910, and he wasn't busy the last few years. So he squeezed in an awful lot of fights in that time. But Langford is so like at the end of he starts January 15th. His last fight is December 23rd. But then January 6th, he's in Salem fighting Andy Watson again, 12-round draw with the Professor Andy Watson, another rival of his early career. So he didn't take any time off. So even though it's a season, even though at the end of 1903, the newspaper proclaimed Langford the New England champion, not they mentioned his win over Gans, but that wasn't why he was a New England champ. It was like Shadow Morris and Joe Reed and some of the other guys he beat that proved and Patsy Sweeney that proved he was the top New England guy. But he's got a lot of bragging rights. But because of the schedules, it's still unknown what he's going to do. So there are still people chasing a fight with him. Some people are wary, but other people still thinking about it. But then by the end of '04, I saw in the paper, Honey Melody, they were saying that they were practically matched. That one of the clubs practically had the match to fight a couple, week and a half out. Then I saw Melody was going to decided to go travel because fights would come together very quickly. Like I saw in articles the Tuesday before, I think it was the Monday or the Tuesday before the fight against Joe Gans was when I first saw in the paper where they said they're practically matched to meet. And we have a good write up. We did. I can't remember. Did we do a show on this, Josh? We have a good write. That's the full. We'll get to this fight in December. I'll be doing that. I'd love for you to come on that show. But we have the full round by round of Langford and Gans at the end of 1903. Very important fight. So we have a pretty good write up of that. Gans had a pretty badass 1903, even though Blackburn got the best of him in a no decision, and Langford got him on points. You can see he fought Dave Holley, the aforementioned Dave Holley, the day before in a different city. So it's pretty wild. But that year he stopped Gus Gardner. Oh, that was a DQ, but he stopped Steve Crosby in 11, stopped Jack Bennett in 5, Tom Tracy in 9, Willie Fitzgerald in 10, Buddy King in 5. 6 rounds against the almost indestructible Joe Grimm, but did beat him up. And then 6 rounds over Eddie Kennedy, drew with Holley, lost to Blackburn, newspaper decision, beat Holley, newspaper decision, and then lost to Langford on points. So he still had the championship because for Blackburn would have had to stop him, and that was you're stopping Gans at that point inside 6. Good luck, buddies. But Blackburn did get a lot of praise for getting the best of him. In fact, even fighting even with him was something impressive with Gans. Same with Langford, especially as he got bigger and bigger. But like I was saying, by the end of their rivalry, he was too big for Holley. He was now the stronger guy. Whereas when they first met, in the first couple fights, Holley was stronger. Although Langford had the cleaner technique. Langford already had a great jab cross. George Byers, a former middle and heavy colored middle and heavyweight champion, was giving him tips and tricks, and he retired. I think a little bit after this, he officially retired, but I did see an article in '04 that he was looking for he was ready to be matched with someone. But I pulled the still shot up earlier. I'm not sure what I did with it. Of George, yeah, there he is, staring out at us like, look at this. That's in Vernon, California. That's the third fight with fireman Jim Flynn. Langford had trouble finding opponents. He would go to the other coast. He went to England, Paris, Panama, Australia. He went lots of places around the world to get fights. So here he is in California with his third match with Jim Flynn. There's George Byers. We have footage highlights of this fight. This was very clinch heavy rules. Something you mentioned, Josh. Different styles he had to use. and utilized because, like, say, the fights in California, at least this in Vernon, California, lots of clinch work, lots of stuff that wouldn't fly today in that Flynn fight. Um, but then on when he went to England, there's very clean rules, very easy to get DQ'd in England. In fact, when he fought Bill Lang there, the video I played earlier of the Bill Lang fight, Lang fouled out. He was getting his ass kicked, but he fouled out in the sixth round, and Lang had also fouled out in the fight before, in the first round. So it was real easy. Like if you hit someone when they were down, you didn't get a warning. You were done. If you fouled, if you hold and hit, you're done. So it's like a clean style of fighting. Langford went from the really rough and tumble, and that was Fireman Jim Flynn's favorite style. So he fought him multiple times. The first three fights they had, at least, were in that kind of rule set. But he's also going to England and schooling Bill Lang, who's more of like a clean style fighter. He's like circling. I would say he's doing the Jack O'Brien, but he is kind of sort of like he's trying to stick and move. It's just that whenever he plants, Langford outguns him, even though he's 30 pounds lighter. He's just stronger. You can see there, he's just kind of wrestling him around, playing with his food a little bit. He gets jabbed a couple times. Lang does land some good stuff on him, but he just can't stay in there. Langford's like just getting warmed up when he's already like starting to wilt, shaking his head and stuff. It was the experience. This is way later. This is 1911. We're talking about Langford in 1904, who already had great experience and was considered a top welterweight and had been considered one of the finest lightweights in the country even before he beat Gantz. He did turn some heads, like these guys, because the matchmaking and all the different clubs and places you could go fight, so you could very quickly amass an intense resume. That's what Holley did. It's what Gans did. It's what Langford did. It's what Blackburn did. Blackburn a little bit less, but once Blackburn's career got cranked up, yeah, he was very busy too. Like I'd said, we're not sure about all the fights he had, Blackburn. But yeah, so Langford, like he was able to deal with very, and like in Australia, at least in one of the Australian fights with the great Sam McVeigh, the ref was overzealous and wouldn't let them fight inside at all. And I feel like I read an official had to come in and tell him to cool it off a little bit because they were going so timid because they were afraid to be DQ'd. I feel like that might have been their last fight in the Australian series, early 1913. Because Langford had beaten him four times in 1912 after Langford went 1-0-1 against McVeigh in 11. Part of that series. I mean, this podcast is gonna get to all these fights. I'm gonna circle it back around, but certainly Langford, his season to season, he spanned multiple generations of fighters, but he also spanned the weights all the way down from the amateur tournament I saw him win 135, and the lightweight limit 133, I think, for championship at the time when he turned pro. So I don't know if he ever actually had to make 133 or if he was weighed for any of those fights, but he was around that bit. And then went up and was over 200 pounds. I mean, James Toney went from middleweight all the way up to heavyweight, and he was a chunky heavyweight. He was round by the end of it. But James Toney was like a 200-pound quarterback in high school. So he was never 135 pounds, not since he was a little kid. Langford was actually fighting professionally at 135 and then ended up fighting the big guys like McVeigh, Harry Wills, Tiny Jim Herman, George Godfrey, some big ass dudes. The kind of guys, if they were walking around today, you'd be like, okay, yeah, he's big. He's big. He's not small. Because those narratives that guys are too small. Well, Usyk I know he put on a few pounds, but a guy who could make 200 came up, and who is he? He's like a top 2 heavyweight in the world right now. So yeah, it can be done just because he's not crunched. He doesn't come in, to my eye, he doesn't come in crunched down like some of the photos you see of some of these guys. Like Sam McVeigh could have been, well, at times he was up at around 220, but when he was 200, he was absolutely ripped with a tiny waist. You know what I mean, Josh? Like, or even say battling Jim Johnson. Not a very technical fighter, but look at him. That is a lean, muscular gentleman coming barreling at you, heavy guy. He could be even heavier if he had a belly and boobs like some of these guys, if you'll excuse the term. I don't want to sound dismissive. I mean, some guys fight really well. Hell, two-tone Tony Galento knocked Joe Louis down, and he was practically round. So, you can't laugh at the belly. Langford was still not clocking guys left and right when he was fat. So It's not to be dismissive, but like a big lean guy could easily carry more weight. We saw it with Wilder. He did pretty well for to put it mildly, but like being a very lean heavyweight. And later he put on weight. You could see his frame could take a lot more weight, but maybe he was even better when he was faster and lighter. I think later in Harry Will's career, when he was a little bit heavier, he wasn't what he once was. That picture on the right, I think, is when he was younger. He's lean, he's big, long and lean and mean. And Langford, when he was in great shape, he was formidable and he would bully bigger guys because of how hard he could hit. And also his technique. Like it's not just that he threw, it's that he had the different combos to put every single pound of his body, like Rocky, but with better footwork. Every pound of his stuff. This might be a little loud, folks, but this is a little thing of him against Jim Flynn in 1910. This is a little. You'll see him jab, and then he retreats the uppercut, and then he throws like a hellacious left to the body, almost a forearm to the body, but it's those long arms reaching around the kidney. Look at this stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like he's putting his whole body into those shots. That's what Rocky Marciano did, although he didn't have that experience of the lighter weights where you have to have good footwork. So I mean, if you're fighting guys like Blackburn and Gans and you don't have good footwork, then you're going to hit a ceiling real fast. Same with Holley. You got to be good. Although Holley had bad matchups. Was it Vernon Campbell? Was that the fighter's name? Gave Holley a lot of trouble in their different fights. I can't remember his name. Well, it's not important, but anyway, you can see in that Flynn thing, like when he throws that uppercut, he's pushing up off the floor. He's pushing. He's like, there's more going on than just some arm or just the turn of the body and the hips. Like he's punching from the roots of the earth, and his whole massive shoulders and back and this gigantic barrel chest that on a 5'7.5" guy just doesn't belong there. Belongs on like a 6'2" guy with a big chest. And that whole thing slings that long arm into the kidney or the liver. Like that's why guys like Harry Wills, Gunboat Smith, all kinds of dudes that he fought, especially the ones who met him when he was in or close to his prime. Flynn said he was just the hardest hitter of the lot. Gunboat said he ruined him. Harry Wills said that he made you want to look at your back and see if his fist was coming out the other side. But we can see in that little clip, which I'm going to play just one more time, folks. Just look at that left, like everything, because it's hard to see. And also, actually, Josh, what you were saying earlier about the footage, these are hand cranked cameras. It's not even. You can't see the full fluidity of the movement because some guy's just there, probably drunk, probably getting really hyped up when the action gets going, and he's trying to maintain the speed, just cranking it by hand. So that's part of the reason it's hard to appreciate. You'd be like, oh, it's not moving that good. No, some of these guys move like butter. Not Jim Flynn, he was a battler, but guys like Gans, you see his footage, you're not going to get the same like smooth appreciation. So you do have to interpret things. But if you look at the tactics with Langford, sometimes I slow down and look at just the footwork, just zoom in and just look at the feet and look at his positioning compared to the opponent. You can learn a lot. But let me play this Yeah I Mean again. Yes. And that's me on guitar. That's my lick right there. In fact, Josh, do you mind if I play another little video here?
Oh yeah, no problem at all. Feel free.
All right, so this is showing another technique Langford used against guys like Flynn who came in barreling in. This is one of the reasons that nobody's sane really, if you weren't being carried, if it wasn't if Langford didn't have a reason to keep you around, don't do this, which is come charging in. Although Flynn lands like 6 or 7 hooks within the first 10 seconds of the fight with Langford, this third fight, because he got blasted in under 2 minutes in the first fight. The second one, people weren't sure if Langford was taking it a little easy on him or not giving it his all, but Flynn got the edge. And then in the third fight, Flynn's come barreling in, but Langford has this technique, and it's in the training footage for the Bill Lang fight, although he didn't really use it that much in that fight because you're not supposed to clinch. But this shows the training footage compared to Langford, where he's using that long arm to just, and his he's set low, but the long arm, he's got giant shoulders to protect his head. He's pushing off of Flynn and then switching stance and throwing these massive things. And you see, I like seeing when Tyson switches like into that frontal and then real rapidly to the side. You see it maybe echoes of that in what Langford's doing here, although it's a little different. But check this out.
What you wanted and what you got, they're never the same. Make you wonder why you go on.
Yes, that's the fuller version. That's the song from my band from back in the day. That's old now though. That song's probably 15, 16 years old. But anyway, but that shows you him sort of posting off and using that to keep him at bay. But he's got really long arms and he's set low and he has a flat head, giant shoulders, like I said. So when Langford got heavier, even though he wasn't as heavy as his opponents, he was built for his pounds. He was built more ruggedly than even the big guys he was fighting. He was a little ball. He had a really good chin. So if you wanted to plant and throw with him, he hits harder than you and he can take it more than you. Certain fights, he would just drop his hands with lesser opponents. He would drop his hands and let them just crack on him a few times. He'd do it in sparring to entertain people, but he'd do it in fights too, sometimes against bigger opponents. I'm trying to remember the fighter's name. Was it Andre Anderson? It was someone he fought up in upstate New York, I think in 1911. He let him give him 3 of his best shots and just went right back to work, you know? He was an entertainer at heart, and he was so tough that he could do that. He'd be like, you can crack me because people will laugh. And maybe my people will get a few extra bets in on me, you know, if that persuades some that he can do it. But he was a tank. So like Battling Jim, much bigger than him. I've got a graphic for their series. Let's pull up the Battling Jim Johnson, Sam Langford series. Battling Jim had between, I would say, 30 to 50 pounds on him across their different fights. They had a long series. Let's find Battling Jim's. I hope I didn't delete it. I was trying to make space. Here we go. There's the series. So Battling Jim, too big for Langford to beat, you know, because we know like big 200, like ripped 220, 230, 240 even pound heavyweights are too big for the little guys. There were his results against Langford. Newspaper decision loss in Philly, 2 newspaper decision losses in New York. Drew with him in Boston over 12. I don't know if that was a controversial draw or if he earned it. Couple newspaper decision losses, lost on points in Denver, knocked out in the 12th of 12 in St. Louis, Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, loses on points over 12, lose on points over 10 in Atlanta. I think that was on points. I'm not sure if that's a newspaper decision at that point. Is that, oh, that's 1918. Yeah, I think by then that's on points. Atlantic City, St. Louis. So he wasn't too big. Langford loved big guys. And some of the trouble he had, like Fireman Jim Flynn was of moderate size. He was like 15 pounds heavier than Langford, but he was of moderate size, but he was very busy. He was a battler, a scrapper, and with a lot of experience himself, years of deep experience. He'd been fighting since the 1890s. So, you know, and he would go on. He lost to Langford in 2 of their 3 fights in between 1908 and 1910, but and lost 3 to him later in the 20s. But he knocked out Jack Dempsey in 1917. He came in fast. Dempsey wasn't ready for it. And Flynn, like if you go to YouTube and watch the beginning of the fight between Sam Langford and Fireman Jim Flynn, look how quickly Flynn starts. Comes in, it's almost like a collar tie, and he's throwing left hooks, body, head, head. And so you can imagine, you can picture, if you think about Dempsey, some people like, oh, he threw that fight. No, he fell victim to a really fast start. The newspaper, the Salt Lake City, I think it was, Journal, they were saying that he was too busy counting his money because they started late, haggling over the purse. Flynn had a fast start. Bing, bing, bang. Good night, Jack Dempsey. So Flynn was fucking capable. This was a serious fighter. He challenged for the world title. He was at heavyweight. He was And Flynn was overtly racist, but he fought anybody. So he wasn't racist in his bookings. There were guys who weren't necessarily even racist in their personality who drew color lines and things. After one of Gann's fights with Holley, he drew the color line. He was sick of fighting his fellow colored fighters, wanted to fight uh, battling Nelson for a big purse. It became a big purse. Their rivalry was epic. So it's crazy. Jack Johnson, when he drew the color line, lifted it for battling Jim here in 1913 in Paris when he was under difficult circumstances, but still turning down Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh once they were like in their early 20s and beyond. Not to fight them when they're at the best, but that's just whatever. That's all said and done now. Johnson was great too. Some of these guys cash out. Look at Fury. He has some good performances, great performances in his career. He's one of the powerful heavyweights of his generation, but he just had a real close fight with the top mixed rules fighter in the heavyweight bracket and didn't do very well. Looked kind of past it. What would you say, Josh? What percentage would you say was the fact that Ngannou took this dead serious, which I can tell you he did, and is a pretty inspired athlete. He's very driven and was trained by Iron Mike. And how much was it that Fury looks like he's partying and just doesn't look the same? He looks like he's gone back. You know what I mean? What percentage would you say in your opinion?
Yeah, good question. I haven't seen the fight in actuality. I've just seen some of the discussions surrounding it online. I do intend to check it out at some point. Just hadn't had the chance to do so as of yet. But I do know that this was a very serious fight for Ngannou. And hey, I'm sure Mike Tyson was giving him every bit of knowledge and detail that he could and doing it in a way to allow for him to work it as best he could from his own standpoint. So, having not seen it and just knowing a little bit about Ngannou and what he's been through just beyond the boxing aspect and knowing Fury, yeah, I think it's one of those. Yeah, it's hard to make a percentage. I think it kind of both things. I would say 50-50, both things in some sense.
Yeah, I guess it's unfair of me to ask you if you haven't fight. And that's what I remember now on your podcast. Was that yesterday or the day before? That awesome podcast you did with Bruce and fellas. That was a great podcast too, man. You should drop that in the comments of this video after we get off. Jump over to YouTube and slap the link there. I'll pin it. But you mentioned you hadn't seen the fight, and I totally spaced on that just now.
Yeah, no problem. It's all good. But I think that it's a combination of both things being true. Probably Fury didn't take it as serious as he should have, and probably wasn't in the best shape that he could have been in. And you could argue that has been the case here for a while. But by that same token, this meant everything for Ngannou, especially considering what was at stake as far as the financial aspect, which will change things for him generationally, especially by comparison to what he made here in the UFC fighting. And I think
he's talking about going back to MMA
for Ngannou.
He's actually talked about going back to MMA, which will be a huge credit to him because he's not going to make the same money. He'll make a lot though. PFL signed him for a lot of money. That was like he was the biggest free agent in the sport at the time. So lots of people were bidding or pretending to bid. Long story, but he was. But yeah, I watched it and I enjoyed it on the level of watching him in his first boxing match. He's fighting a really big guy. He's not the bigger guy this time. And my favorite part of the fight was Fury threw a desperation elbow, like a really hard elbow right through the guard, right? Tagged him flush. Ngannou just, he fights with elbows. You know what I mean? Some guys would cry and it would affect them too much, or it would distract them because, and he's just like, Ngannou's a serious dude. I mean, I didn't give him much of a chance to win. And it turns out he didn't win, but he did a lot better than I thought. He took it very seriously. And I hope he keeps boxing personally. I thought it's freaky, but he actually did well enough. Even if Fury's past it, he should be able to school a guy who's used to be throwing kicks and knees and elbows and tackled people. But it was actually Fury kind of grabbing him. It was Fury throwing the elbow. So that was an interesting fight. Uh, yeah, but if you haven't seen it, it's not a big deal. But certainly Fury is still capable when he's out of shape. That was the same with Langford. That's the same as other. But some MMA fans are trying to treat the fact that Ngannou did pretty well against him like he just fought even with Joe Louis in 37 or 38, rather than what it was, a 37 or 38-year-old guy he was fighting who's not busy. But Langford showed that you could, if you stay busy, especially, you could be super capable, long past it. And Byers had fought past his prime as well, but like he was sort of guiding Langford. He was one of the guys who stayed around him a lot. And that left hook, and Langford's punching ability and the experience of like the seasons we're talking about when he's fighting, lightweight at this time was the premier weight class. It's bothering me that I have the 23rd and not the 24th for that fight I found. I'm gonna have that fixed. But he's doing all this and he's fighting some really fast guys. So later on, when he's fighting bigger guys, even if they're very experienced themselves, like they just can't move physically as fast as the people he's already seen. So that was actually an advantage. Even though he was smaller, he was like, it's okay because I'm now big enough to knock big guys out. You can't, you can only do so much with a chin. It's a human chin. And he had the angles and he had the experience to fight guys like Gans and Blackburn and Holley and other clever fighters, Elbows McFadden, also battlers like Patsy Sweeney. But he and like Tommy Sullivan, I'm not sure how aggressive a fighter he was, but he was a promising welterweight. Langford spanked him. I think it was inside 4. It was definitely inside 4, possibly in the 3rd. And this experience is partly why where other guys would either not grow out of the weight classes continually like he did, or they would just burn out. They would hit their ceiling and or an injury, like with Holley, he got injured in that fight. And then I don't know if he was the same after that. That was a bad head clash, but he did still fight. He even got a world title shot against Joe Gans after that. But he wasn't necessarily what he once was. So the guys like Langford who keep going up the weights to find opportunity, Ezra Charles did it. Other people had to do it. Keep going up to find opportunity. But a lot of guys do that. And then if they keep climbing, even if they're greats, they can hit a ceiling because the size, it just translates differently. Like the great Tommy Loughran, light heavyweight champion, moved up. You can see in the Canera fight, he's out fighting him, but the return artillery is too telling. And as good as he was, as smooth as he was, it's just hard. It's a hard thing to deal with when the power disparity is massive. Langford was small. He wasn't like a big hulking guy, but he was very fast for his power. Fitzsimmons reportedly was very fast for his power. Maybe some of that is that they are lighter, although Fitz was like a long, lean frame, whereas Langford was a cannonball with long arms. The effect is the same. If you have the right technique for your build, you can really throw some leather. That certain great punchers of the past. You can find every build, right, Josh? If depending on who you look at, which time and what weight class, you don't have to be. You can be Rocky with some micro arms, 67-inch reach. That's less than Holley, who was able to make 133. He had like a 71-inch reach, I think. So like Rocky got it done being the small guy with small arms because he was absolutely tough as nails and maniacally driven. And I think he only fought for about 8 years. Everything, every cell of his being into, at least when it was time to get ready for fights, and then got out. And it's like, so other guys had bigger resumes, but it's one, like for me, pound for pound, like I do look at the resume, but that doesn't mean other guys weren't great or wouldn't even do better in head-to-head matchups than resume fights. The resume is different though, because it's if you run into bad matchups enough, then you're really testing your caliber on the next level. And that's what Langford did, and went on to have more fights against Hall of Famers than anyone I'm aware of. And guys like Blackburn, who's in the Hall of Fame as a trainer, but not yet as a fighter, which needs to be fixed. He was one of the most brilliant fighters of the early era. 10 years after he's retired, people still refer to him as one of the cleverest boxers of this era, of the what now they would call in the old timers and things.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty great stuff. Fighting past your prime, like Walcott, some people were saying he was past his prime by the time he was fighting like Langford and them in '04. He'd been fighting a long time, had a ton of fights. He'd even fought heavyweights. He'd fought middleweights when he was still a lightweight. And then as a welterweight, fought all the way up. Credible fighter, but even past it, he was still favored to beat Langford up. He was a betting favorite, not a huge betting favorite from my recollection. I feel like he was like 10-4. There was something. I actually can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But he was the favorite. And then Langford got the edge on it, but it was the ref called it a draw. But so Langford's been in there with one of the great pound for pound punchers in history and one of the greatest welterweight sized fighter. It'd be a light welterweight today, but he walked around near the welterweight limit today. But he fought what would be, 141, 142 in that range once he ground himself down. But so Langford in '04, just part of his '04, he's fought one of the greatest punchers of all time. He smacked the shit out of Elbows McFadden this year, who was considered he was billed as America's greatest blocker. He knew all the dirty tricks, like how to sort of yank your arm or block it and then twist and but he barely landed. He landed like 2 light punches in the 2 rounds he lasted with Langford, and knocked him out for 2 minutes. So Langford's overcoming these things. Now, obviously, Walcott at this point was the bigger threat. So they fought virtually even, but then Blackburn gets the best of him, but then Holley gets the best of Blackburn, and then Gans gets, oh my gosh. And then sometimes they're fighting even. Josh, this has got to be one of the richest eras. But it was just that 1 year, and lightweight was always packed, but that 1903 was epic because Gans had the title and trashed a bunch of guys, beat the crap out of a bunch of dudes, lots of stoppages, and then Blackburn over 6 rounds, and then he gets the best of Holley, but then Langford over 15 rounds. That right away, Langford's internationally prominent now. You don't just beat Joe Gans. 6 rounds is one thing, but 15-round fight with the title was going to be on the line. It was ended up being at 140 instead of 138 ringside. But yeah, Alexander says Fitzsimmons was kind of wasp-like frame, just under 6 foot. Yeah, he was skinny, but the back muscles from the blacksmith. So not all muscle is the same, and not everyone has the same strength to weight ratio. Fitz was bizarrely strong and had good technique too. He hit hard. He was actually dangerous with his hands, legitimately dangerous with his hands. Even as an old man, he just wasn't the guy to F with. You know what I mean, Josh?
Oh yeah.
There's lots of newspaper accounts. Some stuff went to court. He wasn't the guy to play with. But he had that kind of and that was Langford's idol. And you could see in Langford's career an almost unparalleled toughness, but power punching that was compared to Fitz. Later, and when Langford by I don't know when the article was, maybe 09, 010 or 1910, Langford the hardest hitter since Fitz. Neither of those guys were big, but people who are watching the sport, they can tell the difference. You can hear the difference in the shots. I mean, people knew just what was going on. They were following it more closely then than they are now, and they were seeing a larger sample size. So you could have a good win. They're upset wins. They're guys who beat important fighters, but if that's all you did, then you're not held to the same esteem as someone who can go in again and again and again. And that's what Langford did against some of his best rivals. He had the most fights. So you figure, okay, let me ask you this. So let's say Johnson, Langford, McVeigh, Jeanette, and Wills, probably the 5 best heavyweights leading up to Dempsey of that part of Langford's era. And he fought Johnson just the once, 18 or more fights against Wills, 15 fights against McVeigh, 14 fights against Jeanette. So the only one of the other, the greatest, he didn't get the fight with Johnson, but he sure was trying for it. And he had just fought Joe Jeanette, apparently hurt his forearm amid beating Jeanette just a few weeks before he got the opportunity to fight Johnson. So he took it, giving up 30 pounds, and never got the rematch that they were booked for in London in 1909. Unfortunately, Johnson pulled out, but in the original fight, he gave up 30 pounds and a bunch of size and high level experience, and he got thumped on for 15 rounds, but he lasted. So Johnson, later when he's 20 pounds heavier of muscle and bone, Yeah, Johnson's like, oh crap, it's that guy. He couldn't hurt. He beat his face up, but he Langford had no quit in him. So later on, when Langford's walking around heavier, 170 or more, he's an absolutely vicious puncher at this point because he was already a premier puncher when he was in his 130s, 140. By the time he's 150, it's ugly. That's when he knocked Holley's tooth out. He was about 150 in that fight. He beats Joe. He loses to Jeanette that year in '05, loses to Larry Temple, but like in '06, he's on fire other than the couple fights. But those two losses, as you know, those lost to Jack Johnson, lost to another great fighter, young Peter Jackson, who was probably like a middleweight by now, but also fought Johnson, lasted 12 rounds with Johnson, like a very good two-handed puncher, good grappler, wrestler in there. And he lost to each of them, and then he didn't lose again for like till like 36 fights later. That close fight with Jim Flynn. And then 22 fights after that, he loses a decision to Sam McVeigh in a close fight. It's just remarkable. But as you know, Josh, this is the groundwork. You've done so many great videos on fighter careers, especially the old school. You know what it's like. You get experience, and then you try to find big names to get in there with to push your name out there. So now you're not just some dude. You're not just some name. You're like this guy who fought this guy. And that's how you get it going. And Langford very quickly got there. He's not the only one, but he fought his first all-time great at the end of his first full season in his prime when he was actually the champion. Joe Gans when he was the champion. And yeah, he only made 140 ringside instead of 120, 138. But Gans fought Walcott the next year at 141 or 142. So Gans wasn't above. So even though Langford didn't get the title, the press, they were like, yo, he beat Gans, because Gans would also fight welterweights and beat them. So that was the thing. Gans was a lightweight champion, but he was also a welterweight contender. And so he did, even in a non-title fight, did eventually fight Walcott for that title that Langford had fought him for. Holley got the best of Walcott in one of their fights. Just incredible texture. And so we didn't really get into the fourth and final fight in their series. And I guess that will actually come up but at some point in the podcast series. But thoughts on fighters where you read the descriptions of Holley, who comes to mind of a more modern fighter who's sort of tricky like that, who can switch it up so they can fight a certain way, but then especially where like someone's grappling, they start banging the body. I mean, Jimmy McLaren, I love seeing him do that. I'm pretty sure I've seen Tony Canzoneri use that technique. Maybe that was just in vogue in the 30s, but yeah, who's some guys who do that? Like if you try to grab them, it's a bad day. They're gonna like punish you for having your arms up rather than just try to push off or clinch you back. I'm trying to think.
Oh yeah.
James Toney was about that. Like if you were throwing at him trying to crowd him, he was very calm in there. He'd throw a lot of counters, surprisingly quick when he really committed to shots, but a lot of deceptive like pitter patter shots, and then the big one comes and the people don't see it coming. But I don't know that he punched his way out of a lot of clinches. Well, a lot of guys knew not to clinch with him too. I'm not sure. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think he's one. I guess you can say. Well, that's an interesting question. I had to really think about it. Just to think about some guys who are like that, because there are a number of guys who, hey, if you grab them, they're not going to stop punching, and they're going to keep laying into you, which is what they teach you. And you can hear them teaching that in the amateur world as well. Hey, let the referee jump in there and stop breaking it up. I think like Sean Porter, he's one of those guys who will get in very aggressive, not stop punching. Of course, he's recently retired. But yeah, there have been a number of them over the years. I'm just trying to think back myself. It was a good question, and one I feel like I had to think about it. Just looking at it from the standpoint in which you presented it. But yeah, there have been those that are
yeah, it's all good. I'm having trouble thinking myself. Let me ask you a different question. So here we have Langford fighting Bill Lang, who's got a similar reach, only a slight reach advantage, fingertip to fingertip, but he's 30 pounds heavier. So who's someone smooth who could go in under these rules and beat a smooth fighter, or like someone who's taken that approach like Lang was, where he's giving ground a lot and then trying to plant and fire?
Oh, I
Who's
think
someone
they.
you would put in there? Not necessarily of Lang's size, maybe of Langford's size. Who's someone you think would do well against that sort of circling style that Jack O'Brien, sort of in and out, circling angles?
Yeah, yeah. Generally, guys who are apt at cutting the ring off. I think a guy like Terrence Crawford, just given his overall skill set, mentality, and demeanor in the ring, I think he's someone who would be very good at jumping in there, cutting the ring off, and really applying his trade in that particular way. Just thinking about a guy who would certainly be trying to stay away from him and really not engage in that manner. He's one certainly, and you could argue there's some others who operate in a similar fashion. I mean, even Errol Spence. I mean, he was known for, or he is known for, uh, really cornering a guy and starting to dig into the body. Just thinking about two welterweights who are out there right now. So he's a guy who is known for that and willing to go in and do what he needs to do in the trenches there. Man, there are others in varying weights when you really think about it. Think about a guy like Chocolatito. He's one of those guys who can throw an amazing amount of punches, and that's something that made him popular for sure. But man, he just has a way of finding you there in the ring. So, and I think he's shown that over the course of his career, even here in the latter portion of his career. As a matter of fact, want to see him back in the ring. But yeah, he's one of those guys that he just finds a way to reach you when you're in there, no matter the situation, just really lay into you with punches. So he's one of those individuals. Another guy who is coming up in the ranks right now, but is already making a statement in under 10 fights. Oscar Colazo is a minimum weight fighter out of Puerto Rico. Been impressive as far as his career thus far, but he's another one of those guys. He's just found a way to just always cut the ring off and really lay into a fighter and essentially break them down in a certain capacity. Many more, certainly, many more that are out there, 140 pounds right now. You have Gary Antoine Russell. So, Antoine Russell, one of the Gary brothers, he's another one. He just has a way of, man, just being on that offensive charge and really just getting to individuals, regardless of how they operate stylistically, but even those guys who have more of a finesse to them, and he's aggressive in that way. So, yeah, a number of guys out there, man, and I'm sure there are more examples that we can think of if we really, just kind of dive a bit further into it.
Yeah, maybe that's a whole show waiting to happen
Yeah,
because we're almost 2 hours deep on just on the one subject. We did wander far afield, as it turns out, but that's how it goes with a career like this because it's all interrelated. And a guy like this who spanned different weight classes, fought so many greats and powerful champions and contenders of different weight classes, and just across so many years, it's pretty insane because he was long past his best before he stopped fighting at the highest levels, predictably fighting at the highest levels. He was already gone. He was already pretty, like we said before, he had like six more fights. He got hurt mid-year against Fred Fulton, got his eye smashed in, and then still had six fights before the year was out. Went 4-2. Lost to Harry Wills, being knocked out Kid Norfolk brutally. The last fight of the year. He was operating with one eye at this point, but he had so much experience, these guys, and the power. So even Fitz, when he was older, he was still world class. Now, when he was extremely old, that changed, but when he was older, he was still world class because that power makes a big difference. I think that was part of it with James Toney. Not that he always punched with power, that he had a lot of technique and he knew how to commit his weight efficiently. So when he did really go, he could land some really vicious shots. He just didn't always throw as many as people wanted him to early in the fight. But he knew how to throw his weight around, even though he was larger, and he was keeping up with guys who were of a similar weight, who are his size, but without the fat. So it is possible. We do have some examples in the modern era of guys who can, like Andrew Ruiz, not necessarily like super trim when he upset Joshua, but he very fast hands. So you look at a still shot of him, if you put it in black and white and said, "Oh, this guy's from 1913," you'd be like, "Oh, who's this guy?" Same with Tony Galento, but that doesn't mean these guys can't fight. Galento looked, he was a bartender, smoked cigars, drank beer and stuff, but he was one of the top contenders by the time he got his shot. And he knocked Lewis down. A lot of great fighters did not knock Joe Lewis down. So it's just how it goes sometimes. But Galento's overall career, I mean, obviously he didn't win the fight either, but it's the whole career and these greats who are in there, not just once or twice with great fighters, but again and again and again. Like Gans, Holley did it, Langford did it, Blackburn did it. Langford did it in the absolute extreme. But it's just, so there's just different levels. And I think that's why, for me personally, Langford just, for me, he's my greatest, but just the way I measure it, because I can't find, there aren't too many resumes you can compare to it. There aren't too many guys out there who can even, to me, be in that conversation for that depth and breadth of a career. It's just a handful of guys. It's like Greb, Rosenblum had a ridiculous career, but not as much success and didn't give up as much weight. But then like Hank Armstrong, Sugar Ray Robinson, Greb, and Langford, those four, okay, I'll set those aside. But other guys on the monster resumes may be less prolonged success fighting that kind of adversity, but lots of great fighters. I mean, Barbados Walcott, one of the great welterweights and multi-weight fighters. I mean, he was tiny. He was like 5'1.5". And I think he only had like a 7. He didn't have very long arms, maybe 69-inch reach. But he was 5'1.5", so he had long arms for his height. But so like Langford, but in a smaller scale, he could punch up at guys, come flying up, sometimes even off his feet to catch these big guys. And had some as you know, Josh, had some badass wins for a little dude.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely terrifying, but it's commitment. Just like people like to talk about the Hawk, and his punching power. It wasn't just that he had big arms or something, or he turned his hips real quick, but it was also like just the sinew and just everything and that instinct for landing with full total commitment at times. I know he also knocked guys out with like less than full commitment, but some of those punches are absolutely destructive where people will look at him and say, even above his weight. Stanley Catchell was like that. Where people they were talking about him as just one of the hardest hitters in the sport, even though he was a middleweight. At the same time, they were talking about Langford. There were actually quite a few people who thought it would be Langford or Catchell that dethroned Jack Johnson, not the full-sized heavyweights. Didn't work out that way, but there were a lot of people who credibly thought that, real experts on the sport who thought Catchell actually had a shot against Johnson. He got a knockdown, but, he didn't. But that pissed Johnson off, who liked to play with his food, and then he immediately just absolutely flatlined him. Johnson could really hit when he wanted to. That wasn't necessarily his approach. But like with Langford, once in a while they get ticked off, and they get like Kid Norfolk got the full treatment from Sam Langford because he'd been questioning if he was still elite, and he absolutely blasted him. So don't get a rise. Don't talk smack to Michael Jordan, and don't tick off certain guys. Ali was a bit like that. Don't wind that guy up. And if he says, "Call me Muhammad Ali," just yes, Mr. Ali. You know what I mean, Josh? Like, don't rile up Muhammad Ali. Don't give him extra reasons to elevate his game. I don't know if Langford was always like that. He was pretty easygoing, but there are guys not to get run afoul of because it gives them extra power. These guys, I don't even know if they had they were called bitter rivals, but I think that was more in fight terms. I don't think they necessarily had a bad relationship. I don't actually know. Just to circle all the way back, let's randomly transition back to the thing. But it's a crazy career, and even early in his career, compared to his contemporaries, Langford's fighting a very hard schedule. I think that's worth mentioning, Josh. 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, very tough schedule. He doesn't go undefeated any of those years, but he goes undefeated in 1907, 1908, 1909, only one loss in 10, one loss out of a busy schedule in 11, undefeated in 12, 2 losses in 13, 1 loss in 14 to the great Jeff Clark. And then 15, he has more than one loss. But it takes that, it's like 1915 when he's not keeping a stupendously winning record. It's just madness, right? Oh, I think you're muted, Josh. Plus, I just suddenly stopped talking after like a 40-minute monologue. My fault, folks. Yeah, but these guys are busy. Let me jump over the chat real quick. Someone says something. Oh, I see. Josh typing. Buddy Bear, Max's brother, is underrated. He's in a lot of TV shows and films. Yeah, and apparently Rosenblum did a lot of movie stuff after his career, but like a lot of stuff is lost. Cinema and boxing both from back when, unfortunately. But we're lucky to have anything. So with the Langford footage, even though there isn't a lot of it, I'm like, hey man, that's good. And one of those is a very important fight. That was the last fight of 1913 where he fought Joe Jeanette in Paris. So we got footage of one of his great fights with one of his greatest rivals, their 10th fight. First fight in 1905. So I guess by the end of 13, they were having their 10th fight. That's a series right there. They weren't even done. Go, Josh. You still there? Can you hear me, brother?
Yep. I am. I get an echo, though. I think the other users hear it.
Oh, when you talk, yeah, I didn't mute it just now. That's my fault, brother.
Oh yeah, all good.
Yeah, so I think we covered this fight. We covered a great deal of ground. Any final thoughts on maybe on how a crazy schedule, like, is there a comparable version in the amateurs, or is the danger because of, not because of skill, but because of less rounds and things like that? Is it harder to forge, like to rock it up? Is it more prevalent now, like sort of like a more gradual build even within the amateurs than what we see here, schedule wise, from your experience?
Well, there are certainly those fighters that are out there who have a pretty aggressive schedule as far as the amateur side leading up into the pro ranks, of course, generally doing 3 rounds. But that being said, a number of time spent there in the amateurs, applying their trade, racking up a number of fights. Excuse me. Yeah, there's nothing for certainly some of the youngsters, even here around the Washington, D.C. area. I know some who've gone pro here in recent months, things of that nature, but they could have 100 plus fights, nearing 200 plus fights, for sure. You think about some of the others who are out there, even some in other countries and things of that nature, they could have well above that. Vasily Lomachenko, you're talking 400 fights. Essentially, I think he was 396-1 in his career on the amateur side. So he spent a lot of time there. Heck, even Adrian Broner, 300 plus fights as an amateur. So certainly there are those.
I didn't know that about Broner.
Yep. So he's very good amateur decorated, and so yeah, there are certainly those who have more of these aggressive amateur careers, and they're trying to fight as often as they can. And then you factor in the sparring and all that goes into it from a training perspective. Certainly, there's some mileage and there's a lot of time spent in the ring learning the craft and everything. You see less of the same thing from a pro perspective, at least for the elites of the divisions. Generally, yeah, you don't see them having as many fights these days as they did back then. Give or take, there were some differences. Of course, back then, some didn't have amateur careers or much of an amateur career back then, but you did have those that fought on the amateur side and then parlayed that into a pro career. Look at the amount of fights that Sugar Ray Robinson had, and I think he had like 80 something. I want to say around 85 amateur fights, something of that nature. I think it was like 84, 85 or 84-0. So you have kind of the best of both worlds in some sense with some of the amateur guys who have a ton of amateur fights or a good deal of amateur fights, or some of the older guys who have a good deal of amateur fights with a ton of pro fights. And here in modern times, you have some guys and gals who have just a a ton of amateur fights and a decent amount of pro fights as well by comparison to some of their peers, for instance.
Fascinating. Yeah, I guess the gradual build, like up through the different things, less chaotic, probably less harsh of a weeding out process that allows for people to gain, lose, and regain confidence, things like that. This era, it seems like, where the standard of living was so low that when Langford came in, you basically, he had a few amateur fights, you got a prize for winning them, a watch or something they sold, but then he got his fourth fight, he got booted out of the amateur athletic union because he got paid against McVicker. So now he's pro, and he's just basically, he can't go back to the Roanoke and win those watches because he's broken the rules or whatever. So now he's just tearing through it, in a bunch of fights, because he didn't have the luxury of, oh, do I, I mean, he didn't live with his folks. His mama passed and his dad was back in Canada, so, and abusive. So like he was just out there as a teenager, just fighting a crazy professional schedule. Not the only guy to fight a crazy professional schedule as a teenager, but certainly one of them. And the fact that he beat, like, there are other guys who did that, but did they get world-class wins? And that win over Gans, that's at a minimum a top 3 lightweight of all time, I would think. To me, Gans is the number 1, but there are arguments for other guys. People would often mention like Benny Leonard, great Roberto Duran, but for me, Gans overall, because of what he did to guys bigger than him as a lightweight as well. Same with Langford. I would rate him highly as middleweight, because how many middleweights have been actual middleweight, but also a top 2 heavyweight in the world? I don't know if top 1 by schedule, but Johnson was the champ and had done a lot before he became the champ. So Langford's like a top 2 heavyweight as a middleweight. As a guy fighting like 160-ish, he's already there. He's already in that elite. So that's partly why I rate him as middleweight as well as light, heavy, and heavy, because he was doing it at the same time. I mean, Hank Armstrong's another guy, right? Like, he's mostly, title success is mostly welterweight for this guy, right? For Hammer and Hank, but he's a multi-weight threat. Some of these guys, they may not be large in the division where they make the biggest stamp. Langford was like that. When he got up there, he got his groove on. An enormous amount of heavyweight fights. Almost, not always, but often the smaller guys. So regularly that it's kind of a joke. That he's, if he's bigger, then people are like, oh, what's happening here? But he gave up size enough. A couple times he was bigger, and it was ugly, usually for the little guy. But when he was a little guy, he could get it done. Harry Greb was like that too. You could be bigger than him, but he was a middleweight, but he was also a great light heavyweight at the same time, and he had a winning record at heavyweight, as you know, Josh. He didn't get the Dempsey fight, but he had a winning record at heavyweight. He was one of the guys the newspapers were talking about as a potential fight for Dempsey around the time they were talking about Tommy Gibbons. So that's pretty crazy for a middleweight. So that's another guy, another reason why Greb is up there with Langford. The massive Hall of Fame experience and success, and then also being small and being world-class above your weight, like actually above the weight. Pretty insane, I mean, there are cases for guys like Ali, who wasn't the heavier fighter in a lot of his fights. He did pretty darn good. It's at heavyweight where lots of guys have stopping power, but he was like a flurry finisher, it seems like, more than a one punch guy, but he made it work. Joe Louis wasn't the biggest guy in his fights. Marciano certainly wasn't. Dempsey wasn't. In fact, a lot of these dudes, there are times when one of the largest guys is the top guy, Jeffries, Carnera, Riddick Bowe was pretty darn big. How tall was Riddick Bowe?
About 6'5".
Yeah, he was a big fella, big bone too. Very good fighter, excellent fighter. Yeah, Lennox Lewis, a great version of like a modern, larger heavyweight that people talk about. But in my opinion, one of the guys who actually would be really tough for some of these guys. So he could switch it up too. So he could fight a bullying style, but he could also stay behind the jab. And he was really big. with those attributes and fast enough to be dangerous. So yeah, for someone like him, if someone wants to say smaller guys from the past might struggle, well, yeah, because guys his own size struggled too. He had a certain blend. Most guys are not Lennox Lewis. Tyson Fury. I'm sorry if you put Tyson Fury against the prime Lennox Lewis, the Fury that we've seen just saw, he's going down. I I believe that entirely. Just because you're big, it's like, no, you got to be big and sharp. So Langford was small and sharp, but when he was bigger, he was still sharp enough, like um, with Flowers, where he was slow. He was getting pounded on in the first round, but then he did catch him, and he had enough power. He got him out of there. The last Hall of Fame win. And in fact, there are guys nominated for the Hall of Fame. Like Holley's up for nomination. He was up for nomination. They finished voting on the 31st, but Holley was up for who else? Willie Lewis, I think, was up for nomination that Langford beat. Young Peter Jackson, who won and lost and drew with Langford. So even though Langford has the most fights against Hall of Famers, there's some guys who could get in that would even increase those numbers further. And guys who probably should be in. They're guys who deserve to be in or not. I wish they would maybe just put a couple guys, old timers, in a year instead of one. Too many fights happen. You know what I mean, Josh? Too many fights happened in that time to only have one guy a year and 3 modern ones. It should be like maybe 2 and 2 or 2 and 3. Oops, I blacked out the picture. But do you have any closing thoughts? We can keep going if you want. If you have anything on your mind, Josh. I'm just rambling at this point. Look at this massive schedule. We're catching up now. So we did the 4th, and so looking back at the 5th was the anniversary of 1919 fight with great Harry Wills. That was the year Dempsey became the champion, Wills the colored heavyweight champion. And then same day in 1922 fought Jack Taylor. I don't know what happened in that fight. I'm gonna have to look. Then we're off. Then we got 3 fights on the 10th and a massive 4-fight anniversary on the 12th. That's pretty crazy. There's some good fights and there's good opponents in there. Some of it Hall of Fame, some top contenders like Gumbo Smith, young Peter Jackson, who I'm pretty sure it's the young Peter Jackson who retired in 1914. Sim Tompkins, who's up for nomination and not the welterweight of later years, but I don't actually know. I should look that up. I can't remember if Jeff Clark is nominated this year, but he should be. He deserves it. We've looked at on this series. I've looked at several Jeff Clark fights. He was extremely good. Gave Langford a tough time too. Long reach, moderate height, a good height advantage, but moderate overall height. Long ass reach, jabber mover, could flurry. Was more competitive with Langford than some other fighters. And like I said, he was the only guy to beat Langford in 1914. This was the year Langford was on the comeback tear, and he went like 13, 1 and 3. But it was Jeff Clark with those long arms and that mobility in there that managed to get past him. So pretty crazy, especially as he'd been run over in under 2 rounds in their first fight in 1910. So that's a real improved performance, right, Josh? Like you get run over and then you're the only guy to beat the dude in all those fights that year.
Yeah, certainly. It just shows how there can be improvement. So the buck doesn't stop at a single fight or a single loss. There's always that opportunity to come in and change the dynamic at any point. And just thinking about that, and I guess sort of like you're alluding to, I would say in closing, certainly this has been great just being able to discuss these 2 fighters, both 2 great fighters. And I think this just highlights sort of the strides that are being made from a historic standpoint, at least in getting more information out there based on the accounts that were well documented during their periods. And it just adds to just this overall, I would say, steer that is boxing and boxing history in general, because there are certainly many conversations to be had on many fighters. And I know myself, I'm steadily learning new things on a continual basis, pretty much weekly basis, learning new things. And we find about others we find about certain top level or great fighters through other great fighters or top level fighters, contenders, competition just in general. And that's kind of the beauty of it. We have enough of a history, such a deep history, especially by comparison to a number of the other sports, though a number of them do have their own uh, pretty solid history in some right. But with boxing, we have a deep enough history, and just thinking about it from the individual standpoint, that yeah, there are always these opportunities to just become aware of fighters who've had an impact on the sport, and that impact can look different ways, but it's always rewarding. I know just for myself in general, I know it's a similar thing for you there, Brandon, just to become familiarized with these fighters and get to just kind of take part in their stories and share it from our perspective and share it from the perspective of those who were there during that time and those who took that time during those periods to really uplift and document this great sport that we do know as boxing.
Yeah, well said, sir. Yeah, we're lucky. I mean, with some imagination and understanding. See, if we understand that there were expert boxers, master boxers, and brawlers, and combinations of the two, inside and outside fighters, crouching fighters, long jabber movers, all different styles were represented in the early era. There were things that people added or fine tuned over the years, but also inevitably some information is lost. I mean, Sam Langford was learning from George Byers. You know, if you're coming up in boxing, you're learning from even a good coach. You're not learning from a guy like George Byers necessarily, who's been in there with a bunch of class, given up size, sometimes successfully overcome size, very clever, seen it all, seen a bunch of great fighters in person as well. So something is lost. When Jack Blackburn passed away, something was lost. He didn't pass everything on to the people around him, including Lewis. Lewis wasn't a world-class coach. Things are lost. So techniques come and go, and they get recycled, they get reformatted, but they've existed going back. Certainly by the turn of the century, there were all kinds of, but there were master boxers before that. But by the turn of the century, there was all kinds of stuff and this structural framework in many states, dozens of states and around places around the world where you could really get the experience and test it out. So Holley fought ridiculous schedule. Langford fought a ridiculous schedule. Gans did as well before and after he was champion. Not every champion stayed busy, especially at heavyweight, but when Langford was fighting for and holding sometimes the colored heavyweight championship, he stayed busy. So there were guys at championship level who would keep their fight on. Jack O'Brien, when he had title claims, he stayed busy. He had a ton of fights anyway. So this is, it's like it's a real proving ground. And these guys who stood out in this kind of era with these kind of demands, they were special because otherwise you're just going to end up ruining your hands. You're going to get knocked out too many times, or you're going to have poor showings and they won't want to book you because there's all these other guys scrambling to get in every year, all these debuting fighters who are ready to go at this crazy schedule. So Langford very quickly punched his way into being a hot booking. He had a home club, but he was also fighting all over the place. Lots of fights at the Lenox Club where he was based, but also at the Essex Club. And then he also went out to Rhode Island. He went up to New Hampshire. He's fighting all over. And so there was opportunity for it. So in this sort of proving ground, desperation plus opportunity equals epic, all-time great resumes sometimes. Langford's one of those guys. Definitely one of those guys. But Holley had a legitimately badass career himself. He just didn't get same opportunity. And sometimes these guys, circumstance kicks in, especially in this era when careers might not last as many years for most guys. So Walcott shooting himself in the hand, that was crippling for like Holley. That was right when he should be in title contention. And same with Langford at welterweight. Just he got a shot, but like it was, they could have easily rematched at the end of that year if he hadn't been hurt in the Gans fight. So after the Gans fight, I should say. So like sometimes things just work out a certain way and guys don't always get the opportunity. It still happens today, but the way you could get frozen out either intentionally or unintentionally back then with those kinds of schedules, because you got to fight to eat or a fight to have a high standard of living. If you're busy and even if you're not making huge money, if you're fighting a lot, making pretty good money, it adds up. throw in some side bets, get a backer, get a rich backer and stuff, things like that. Side bets with a lot of extra money. Gans was expert with that, making extra money on the side. So we'll fight for this percentage of the purse, but then also 2,500 or 500 or whatever on the side. Sometimes they'd also do that on making weight. So all kinds of ways to work the money. The money's a lot different nowadays, but back in this day, it involved a tremendous amount of fights to become important enough that clubs are willing to put up good money for you to either fight lesser guys and you're the A side, or to come in and test, like as cannon fodder or as a test, an out of town test for the patrons to watch the local top guys. Bit of both. Langford did both. He was the hometown guy. Like when he lost to Holley in that first fight, Holley came to Cambridge, Massachusetts, kicked his ass and went back. I don't know if he had other fights here, but basically came down, beat him good, and then went back. But they kept fighting. They fought in Baltimore, they fought in Philly, and then the last fight they did in Salem, Massachusetts. Salem of the witch trials fame or infamy. But anyway, Josh, I fear if I go any longer, I'm going to lose my voice, which isn't right, because I used to be able to sing for 4 hours in a row, but right now I'm feeling a little scratchy, brother. It's been great having you here, man. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks, folks, for listening on the on Josh's channel, as well as here on mine. Shout out to the chat. Thanks for the interactions, guys. Josh, any final thoughts on top of all of these final thoughts we've been having?
Yeah. No. I'll just say, yeah. Thanks for everyone who dropped by. Of course, Alex, Henry DiCarlo, a number of others who dropped in. Dan, we had a number of others. Eudes Fernandez. I mean, keep going. Big Bear, Impulsive, etc. Stop Motion MMA. Andre Rodriguez, and just a host of others. Clay Marceau. Kid Goku dropped in this thing. So I think that's everyone who at least peeped in, shared a few comments or whatever. Hey, you're appreciated. It makes it all the much better having you join in on this conversation, sharing this great history and that knowledge that you all have as well. So thank you, Random, again, for the invite. I always appreciate having a discussion.
Great having you on, my friend. Let's do this again soon. And folks, have just a fantastic day or night, whatever time it is. And I'm going to send us out with, again, that clip of Langford doing sort of posting off against Jim Flynn, set to the music. Original song's called Day Straight Into Night. It's an old blues I put together back in the day. Have a great day, folks. Thanks for listening.
You wanted and what you got, they're never the same. Make you wonder why you go on.